You're standing on the promenade deck of a 46,000-ton floating palace.
Right.
The ocean around you is perfectly, just flawlessly flat.
Yeah.
Like black glass. There isn't a breath of wind. There's no moon in the sky. And it is so quiet. You can hear the faint, muffled thrum of the engines deep beneath your feet.
Oh, wow.
And in exactly 6 seconds, the largest, most advanced machine ever built by human hands is going to suffer a mathematically inevitable death sentence.
Yeah, it's chilling.
Okay, let's unpack this, because today we're taking you on a deep dive into an incredibly comprehensive source document detailing the sinking of the RMS Titanic.
And this is such an important topic.
It really is. And our mission today isn't to recount the Hollywood movie. We aren't, talking about a fictional romance here.
Right, no Jack and Rose today.
Exactly. We are launching an investigation into the anatomy of a disaster. We're going to deconstruct the myths and look at the hard facts, the physics, the metallurgy, and the cascading series of human decisions that led to one of history's deadliest peacetime maritime disasters.
Because, what keeps us coming back to this story over a century later isn't just the sheer scale of the tragedy.
Right.
It is the fundamental question of why it happened. How a marvel of modern engineering.
The undisputed pinnacle of human industrial achievement in 1912.
Exactly. How that was entirely undone by systemic complacency. It's really a masterclass in how arrogance, combined with a half-dozen environmental and mechanical anomalies, created just a perfectly lethal trap.
I want to start by painting a picture of that baseline arrogance before disaster even strikes.
That's the best place to start.
Because you really have to understand the illusion of invincibility surrounding this ship to understand all the decisions they made later.
Absolutely.
The Titanic was the second of 3 Olympic-class ocean liners built for the White Star Line. And when it entered service, it was the largest ship in the world.
By a wide margin.
Right. And when I say large, I don't just mean like a bit bigger than the competition. It dwarfed everything. The Titanic and its sister ship, the Olympic, were almost 1.5 times the gross register tonnage of Cunard's rival ships.
The Lusitania and the Mauretania.
Yeah, they were nearly 100 feet longer.
And, the scale of the propulsion system alone is just hard to overstate.
I can't even imagine.
Well, to move a vessel of that staggering mass through the water, the reciprocating engines were the largest ever constructed. They stood 40 feet high.
Wait, 40 feet?
Yeah. Just imagine a 4-story building inside the belly of the ship operating these cylinders that were 9 feet in diameter.
That is insane.
It is. And to feed that mechanical beast, the engineering crew, deep down in the stokeholds, they had to manually shovel and burn 600 long tons of coal every single day.
600 tons a day.
By hand.
Shoveled by hand. And then up above decks, it was just obscenely luxurious. I'm looking at the economics of the source material, and it notes that the parlor suites, these were like the most expensive, luxurious suites with their own private 50-foot promenade decks.
Right, the absolute top tier.
Yeah, they cost over $4,350 for a one-way transatlantic passage.
Which back then was a fortune.
Oh, adjusted for today, that is roughly $145,000.
Wow.
For a single one-way ticket.
It functioned as a floating microcosm of Edwardian society, really. You had the absolute titans of industry, millionaires like John Jacob Astor and Benjamin Guggenheim occupying those upper decks.
Just the wealthiest people on the planet.
Exactly. But an often overlooked aspect of the Titanic's design is that even the third-class accommodations were revolutionary for the era.
Really? I feel like third class always gets depicted as like a dungeon.
Right. But they were supplied with plentiful quantities of good food. And for many of the poor immigrants, on board people fleeing poverty or persecution from Armenia, Ireland, Italy, Russia, Syria, the conditions in steerage with actual running water and electric light were actually cleaner and more comfortable than what they had experienced in their own homes.
Oh, wow. So it was this glittering monument to human progress. But before it even made it to the open Atlantic, there was a glaring, terrifying warning sign that everyone just sort of brushed past.
Oh, the New York incident.
Yes. I was reading about the maiden departure on April 10th. The Titanic is leaving Southampton, right, pulling away from the dock. As it navigates the channel, it passes 2 smaller moored liners, the SS City of New York and the Oceanic.
Yeah.
And the sheer physical displacement of the Titanic, like the massive mountain of water it pushes out from its bow and the deep trough it creates behind its propellers, violently lifts the New York and drops it.
It's just simple hydrodynamics, but on a terrifying scale.
Right. The strain is so immense that the thick steel mooring cables on the New York actually snap.
And those snapping cables, I mean, they sounded like artillery fire echoing across the harbor.
That's horrifying.
And the New York wasn't just drifting after that. The hydrodynamics of the water rushing back in to fill the trough created by the Titanic, it literally sucked the smaller ship toward it.
It pulled it in.
Yeah. The New York swung around, stern first, directly into the path of the giant liner.
Oh, man.
It took the incredibly quick thinking of a nearby tugboat captain throwing a tow line, and Captain Edward Smith ordering the Titanic's massive engines into full astern to arrest their forward momentum.
Just slamming on the brakes, basically.
Exactly, and they missed colliding by a distance of about 4 feet.
4 feet. I keep thinking about that margin.
It's nothing.
It's literally nothing. If I could just put this in perspective, imagine you buy a multi-million-dollar hypercar, the most powerful, heavy, advanced machine on the road. You turn the key, you pull out of the dealership lot, and the sheer aerodynamic wake of your car rips the bumper off a parked sedan, and you miss totaling your brand new hypercar by 4 inches.
That's a great analogy.
I mean, shouldn't this have been a massive, screaming red flag about the physics of a ship this size? Doesn't that tell the crew, hey, we might not fully understand how this thing behaves in the water?
You would think so. But that perfectly illustrates the concept of hubris that saturated the entire operation.
She just felt invincible.
Exactly. If we look at the composition of the crew, it explains a lot. Captain Edward Smith had 4 decades of seafaring experience. I mean, he was the Commodore of the White Star Fleet.
He wasn't a rookie.
Not at all. But the vast majority of the 892 crew members were not trained sailors in the traditional sense.
Wait, really? What were they?
They were engineers, firemen, stokers, stewards, and galley staff. The actual watch officers and able seamen, the people responsible for navigating and handling the ship, made up only about 5% of the crew.
Just 5%.
Yeah, they simply lacked the time to truly familiarize themselves with a vessel of this staggering mass and its unique hydrodynamics.
Right, because they hadn't even done full sea trials for weeks. They basically built it, tested it for a few hours, and put passengers on it.
And the culture of the time was just dripping with overconfidence. In a 1907 interview, Captain Smith himself stated, quote, "I cannot imagine any condition which would cause a ship to founder. Modern shipbuilding has gone beyond that."
Modern shipbuilding has gone beyond that. Wow, that quote just gives you absolute chills knowing what's coming.
It really does.
Because that mindset of invincibility traveled right across the Atlantic with them, directly into the path of a massive environmental hazard.
Yes, the ice.
Right. The winter of 1912 had been unusually mild. And counterintuitively, the source notes that a mild winter is actually incredibly dangerous for the North Atlantic sea lanes.
The mechanism there is fascinating, actually.
How does that work?
Well, a milder winter causes the pack ice and the glaciers on the west coast of Greenland to thaw slightly.
Okay.
And that calves a much larger number of icebergs than usual. Those bergs then drift southward on the Labrador Current, floating directly into the main transatlantic shipping routes.
Oh, so they're basically sending a fleet of icebergs down into traffic.
Precisely. In April 1912, it created the worst ice condition for any April in the previous 50 years.
And here's the crucial detail. The Titanic was not flying blind. They didn't just stumble into an unmapped hazard.
No, they knew about it.
I'm looking at the timeline in the source, and the wireless operators received 7 distinct messages from other ships warning of drifting ice. 7. Starting on April 12th from a French liner. Then on the 14th, the day of the disaster, the warnings are relentless. At 9:12 a.m., the Coronia reports bergs and field ice. At 10:28 a.m., the Nordam reports much ice. At 1:54 p.m., the Baltic relays a report of passing icebergs.
And Captain Smith explicitly acknowledged these warnings.
So he read them.
Oh, absolutely. He even took the Baltic's warning to J. Bruce Ismay, who was the chairman of the White Star Line and who was on board as a passenger.
The big boss.
Right. And Ismay kept the message in his pocket and showed it off to a few prominent passengers like it was an amusing novelty before Smith finally asked for it back hours later to post it in the chart room.
An amusing novelty. Unbelievable.
Smith did order a new course to be set, taking the ship slightly further south to skirt the ice field, but crucially, he did not order a reduction in the ship's speed.
Here's where it gets really interesting and honestly so frustrating it makes you want to pull your hair out.
The radio situation.
Yes. The wireless radio on the Titanic, this cutting-edge, state-of-the-art, life-saving communication technology, was essentially being treated as a luxury toy for the rich passengers.
Yeah, that's exactly what it was.
The radio set had actually broken down the day before, so there was this massive backlog of passenger telegrams waiting to be sent to the relay station at Cape Race, Newfoundland.
The structural setup of the radio room is key to understanding this failure. The two radio operators, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, were not actually employed by the White Star Line.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Yeah, they were employees of the Marconi Company. Their primary job, as dictated by the economics of the ship, was passenger communication.
So they were basically customer service reps.
Exactly. Sending stock trades, social greetings, arranging hotel reservations in New York.
So fast forward to 9:52 p.m. on the night of the sinking. The ship Masaba sends a critical warning about heavy pack ice and a great number of large icebergs directly in the Titanic's path.
A very specific, very direct warning.
Right. Jack Phillips receives it, but he's so overwhelmed with sending these trivial passenger messages to Cape Race that there is no evidence this critical warning was ever delivered to the bridge.
He was prioritizing revenue-generating traffic over navigational safety because that was his job.
That is just...
Ugh.
And then comes the final tragic communication failure.
The Californian.
Right. Around 10:07 p.m., the radio operator on the SS Californian, a ship that is stopped in the ice field incredibly close to the Titanic, sends a message. He essentially says, "Hey, old man, we are stopped and surrounded by ice."
And Phillips, who is stressed, exhausted, and trying to clear this massive backlog, angrily cuts him off.
He literally taps back, "Shut up, shut up, I am busy, I'm working Cape Race."
Because the Californian signal was so strong because they were so close, it was physically deafening Phillips in his headset while he was trying to listen to the faint signals from Newfoundland.
So he just yells at him to get off the line.
The cruel irony is that the Californian's message wasn't formatted with the official MSG prefix, which officially designated a message for the captain.
Oh, so it looked like casual chatter.
Right. It lacked coordinates because it was sent in an informal, conversational tone between operators. So Phillips dismisses it entirely.
Wow.
The Californian's operator, Cyril Evans, listens for a bit longer, then turns off his radio and goes to bed.
Because he was just done for the night.
Exactly. Meanwhile, despite knowing there is a massive ice field directly ahead, Captain Smith maintains a speed of 22 knots.
Which is?
That's about 25 miles per hour. For a ship displacing 52,000 tons, the momentum is almost incomprehensible.
To anyone listening today, driving a 46,000-ton hotel through an ice field in the pitch black at maximum speed sounds like absolute undeniable lunacy.
It sounds suicidal.
I mean, how did anyone, let alone an experienced Commodore, justify that?
Well, we have to view this through the lens of 1912 maritime practice. It was absolutely standard across the entire industry to prioritize timekeeping above all other considerations.
So the schedule was king.
Absolutely. Ships ran on strict schedules, much like trains, to guarantee their arrival times. Merchant Navy captains later testified at the disaster inquiries that in clear weather, they would routinely maintain full speed, even if ice was reported, trusting their lookouts to spot it in time.
Trusting the lookouts. So they believed the human eye was a better safety mechanism than just slowing down?
Precisely. Furthermore, ships treated ice warnings as mere advisories, not hard stops. It was widely believed that ice posed little risk to modern steel ships.
Really? They thought ice couldn't hurt them.
History had given them a false sense of security. Close calls were common, and actual collisions hadn't proven fatal to large liners.
Give me an example.
Well, in 1907, the German liner SS Kronprinz Wilhelm had rammed an iceberg head-on. It suffered a crushed bow, but the bulkheads held, and it completed its voyage.
Oh, wow.
And just 4 days before Titanic sank, the French liner SS Niagara struck an ice field nearby and managed to steam to New York under its own power.
So people were hitting ice and just walking away from it.
Exactly. The entire shipping industry had normalized the deviance. It wasn't just Captain Smith acting as a reckless rogue. This systemic culture dictated that you push through the danger.
Normalizing the deviance. You see other people take the risk and survive, so the risk stops feeling dangerous.
Right.
That perfectly sets the stage for the night of April 14th, because all of that human hubris sailed directly into an environment that almost feels maliciously designed to trap them.
The environmental conditions at 11:30 p.m. are critical. As the Titanic approached the ice field, the weather shifted into a state that is exceedingly rare in the open North Atlantic.
What happened?
The ambient air temperature dropped to near freezing, but the wind died completely. The ocean became utterly, perfectly calm.
Colonel Archibald Gracie, a first-class passenger who survived, described the sea as being, quote, like glass, so smooth that the stars were clearly reflected.
Yeah.
Which sounds poetically beautiful. But as the source explains, in this specific context, it's a death sentence.
It is a meteorological sign of nearby pack ice, which dampens wave action. But far more dangerously, it removed the one visual cue the lookouts desperately relied on in the dark.
Which was?
If there had been even a slight swell, the waves breaking against the base of an iceberg would have created a line of white water, a phosphorescent glow from the agitated plankton that could be seen from miles away, even in the dark.
But because it was flat.
With the sea like flat glass and absolutely no moon in the sky, the icebergs were virtually invisible. They were just massive dark shapes swallowing the stars.
And to compound this, the lookouts up in the crow's nest, Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee, who are 95 feet above the deck staring into the freezing wind, they don't even have binoculars.
Right, the missing binoculars.
I read about this mix-up in Southampton. The binoculars were locked in a cabinet, and the officer with the key, David Blair, had been transferred off the ship at the last minute and forgot to hand the key over.
A tiny human error.
Though the source makes a really interesting point. Binoculars might not have even helped.
That's a highly debated point. But optically speaking, binoculars magnify available light. If there is no light to magnify, if you are looking at a dark object against a dark background in pitch blackness, binoculars simply give you a magnified view of the darkness.
That makes sense.
The lookouts actually reported seeing a soft horizon where the sky and the sea blended together, an optical illusion caused by the freezing air resting on the slightly warmer water, which made spotting a dark object even harder.
So it is exactly 11:39 p.m. Fleet is peering into the dark, and he suddenly spots a massive black mass blocking out the stars directly in their path.
It's about a quarter of a mile away.
He immediately rings the lookout bell 3 times. He picks up the telephone connecting the crow's nest to the bridge. Sixth Officer James Moody answers. Fleet asks, "Is there anyone there?" Moody says, "Yes, what do you see?" And Fleet delivers the most famous line in maritime history. "Iceberg, right ahead."
Moody relays this instantly to First Officer William Murdoch, who is in command of the bridge at that moment. Murdoch has mere seconds to react.
Just seconds.
He immediately orders Quartermaster Robert Hitchens, who is at the ship's wheel, to turn the ship. He gives the specific order, hardest starboard.
Now, due to the complex steering conventions of British ships at the time, which were still based on the mechanics of old sailing tillers, ordering the tiller hardest starboard actually turns the ship's rudder and thus its bow to port to the left.
Yes, very counterintuitive today, and he also instantly signals the engine room.
And here's where the mechanical reality of a 1912 Leviathan works entirely against them. It wasn't like turning a steering wheel on a car.
No, not at all.
The steam-powered steering mechanism took up to 30 seconds just to physically muscle the massive rudder over to the required angle.
Right, the sheer physics of it.
Murdoch is attempting what's known as a port-around maneuver. The goal is to swing the bow left to narrowly miss the ice, and then immediately swing the stern back to the right, pivoting the entire 882-foot ship around the obstacle like a snake slipping past a rock.
Concurrently, there is the highly debated issue of the engine orders. It has been a long-standing historical narrative that Murdoch threw the engine telegraphs to full astern, attempting to throw the massive engines into reverse.
Like we saw in the movies.
Right. However, more recent analysis of evidence from lead fireman Frederick Barrett suggests the stoplight came on in the boiler rooms, indicating Murdoch merely ordered the engines to stop.
Okay.
But regardless of whether he stopped them or reversed them, altering the momentum of those massive reciprocating engines takes agonizing time.
I was thinking about this engine order, and I want to bounce a theory off you.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
If you are driving a car on an icy road and a deer jumps out, the worst thing you can possibly do is slam on the brakes. Your tires lock up, you lose all traction, and you lose the ability to steer. You just slide forward into the crash.
Yes.
To steer around the deer, you actually need to maintain some forward momentum. By killing the engines on the Titanic, did Murdoch inadvertently kill their ability to turn?
The fluid dynamics support your theory entirely.
Really?
The Titanic's massive central rudder sat directly behind the center turbine propeller. It relied heavily on the high-velocity slipstream of water pushed by that propeller to generate the hydrodynamic force needed to push the stern sideways and turn the ship quickly.
Oh, wow.
By stopping or reversing the engines, Murdoch effectively starved the rudder of that crucial water flow. He severely impaired the ship's turning radius. Had he simply left the engines at full ahead and ordered the turn, maintaining maximum water flow over the rudder, the ship might have swung fast enough to miss the iceberg with feet to spare.
Well, what if he hadn't turned at all? What if he just held the wheel straight?
If they had hit the iceberg head-on, the physics of the disaster changed completely. The ship would have crumpled like an accordion.
But it would have survived.
It would have instantly killed the firemen and crew in the very front compartments, and the deceleration would have thrown passengers out of their beds. But the ship's design likely would have survived.
That's crazy.
The watertight bulkheads would have contained the flooding to the first one or two compartments. We have real-world proof of this because the sister ship, the Olympic, later rammed a German U-boat head-on during World War I and also collided with a light ship.
Same exact design.
Exactly. The bow twisted and buckled catastrophically, but the hull's overall integrity held. It's the tragic irony of Murdoch's perfectly executed yet ultimately doomed glancing blow that caused the fatal damage.
And we really need to look at the specifics of that damage.
Yeah.
Because the Hollywood myth is that the iceberg acted like a giant serrated can opener, ripping a massive 300-foot continuous gash in the side of the steel hull.
Right. That's the famous image.
But reading the metallurgical analysis in the source, that's not true at all, is it?
Not in the slightest. Even back at the 1912 British inquiry, the chief naval architect, Edward Wilding, calculated that based on the rate of flooding, the actual area open to the sea couldn't have been a giant gash.
How big was it?
He estimated the total opening was only about 12 square feet.
12 square feet.
Modern ultrasound surveys of the wreck and the incredibly detailed 2025 National Geographic digital scan have absolutely confirmed this. It wasn't a gaping wound. It was a series of 6 narrow, intermittent slits following the horizontal line of the hull plates.
Wow.
If you combined all the damage into one square, the total area was no bigger than a couple of sheets of A4 paper.
12 square feet of damage. A few sheets of paper sank a 46,000-ton ship. That is, I remember reading something about the metallurgy, that it wasn't the thick steel plates themselves tearing, but the actual rivets holding them together. Were they using cheaper materials to save time?
It wasn't necessarily about cheapness, but about the mechanical limitations of the shipyard.
So?
The steel plates in the straight central part of the hull were held together with triple rows of mild steel rivets installed by massive hydraulic riveting machines. Those were incredibly strong. But the extreme curvature of the bow and stern meant those bulky hydraulic machines couldn't fit.
But because of the shape.
Exactly. So the plates in the bow section had to be riveted by hand using double rows of wrought iron rivets. And these specific wrought iron rivets, known in the trade as best, or number 3 iron, had a high level of slag inclusions.
Slag is like a glassy impurity left over from the smelting process, right?
Exactly. Slag is a silicate impurity. In small amounts, it makes wrought iron easier to forge. But if the concentration is too high, it creates microscopic fault lines.
And then it got cold.
Right. When you expose a high slag rivet to extreme sub-zero temperatures, it reaches its ductile to brittle transition temperature. The iron literally becomes as brittle as glass.
So when the 52,000-ton mass of the ship scraped against the unyielding, immovable wall of the iceberg, the steel plates didn't tear. The brittle wrought iron rivets simply snapped off under the immense shear stress, or popped open, allowing the seams between the overlapping steel plates to just spring apart, letting the ocean rush in.
Yes, it was a catastrophic failure of the fasteners, not the armor.
And because it was a glancing blow, the ship essentially bumped along the underwater spur of the iceberg.
It bumped, popped the seam open, scraped along, bumped again, popped another seam.
The damage extended intermittently along a 300-foot section of the starboard hull, opening that fatal sequence of narrow gaps.
Up on the decks, the reaction was almost comical in its mildness. Passengers felt a slight vibration. One survivor, Lady Duff Gordon, said it felt just as though somebody had drawn a giant finger along the side of the ship.
Just a scrape.
First-class stewards thought the ship had just dropped a propeller blade. People went back to their card games. But down below, deep in the mechanical bowels of the ship, a mathematical death sentence was already underway.
The physical reality of those narrow slits down in the engine and boiler rooms was instantly apocalyptic.
It must have been terrifying.
Water, under immense hydrostatic pressure from the ocean outside, began jetting in at an estimated rate of 7 long tons per second.
7 tons a second.
To put that engineering nightmare into perspective, That is 15 times faster than the ship's massive bilge and ballast pumps could pump it out. Their combined maximum capacity was only 1,700 tons per hour. The ship was taking on 400 tons a minute.
And the human element of this is terrifying. Down in number 6 boiler room, second engineer J.H. Hesketh and leading stoker Frederick Barrett were standing right next to the hull when the ice hit. A jet of icy water hit them with the force of a fire hose.
They must have been thrown.
They barely scrambled through the watertight doors before they slammed shut, but the real heroism happened when the engineers realized what would happen if the cold water hit the boilers.
We have to consider the thermodynamics here, right?
Yes. These massive, multi-story boilers are functioning at peak capacity, burning white hot, full of high-pressure steam.
Right.
If 28-degree freezing seawater rapidly rises up and engulfs the outside of those superheated metal boilers, the sudden, violent thermal shock would cause the metal to shatter.
Oh, man.
It would trigger a catastrophic steam explosion that would literally blow the bottom of the ship apart from the inside, sinking them in minutes.
So to prevent that, stokers and engineers were ordered to stay below. They were standing in waist-deep, freezing black water in the dark, frantically drawing the massive fires out of the furnaces and manually venting the high-pressure steam up the funnel pipes.
They deliberately stayed in a flooding, freezing steel tomb to prevent the ship from exploding, buying the passengers up top time they didn't even know they needed.
It is an act of unimaginable, disciplined bravery.
Sure.
And while those men are fighting the water, the chief designer of the Titanic, Thomas Andrews, who was on board to take notes for future improvements, goes down into the bowels of the ship with Captain Smith to assess the damage. And Andrews, armed with nothing but a blueprint and a thorough understanding of buoyancy, does the math.
And the math is devastating. If we connect this to the bigger picture of naval architecture, the Titanic's design was actually incredibly robust for 99% of conceivable scenarios.
How so?
The lower decks were divided into 16 separate compartments, divided by 15 transverse watertight bulkheads. The ship was mathematically designed to stay afloat with any two of those compartments completely flooded. It could even survive with the first 3, or under certain conditions, the first 4 compartments fully open to the sea.
But because Murdoch tried to dodge it and scraped along the side, the iceberg opened exactly 6 compartments. The forepeak tank, the 3 forward cargo holds, number 6 boiler room, and a small section of number 5 boiler room.
And this is where the fatal flaw in the watertight bulkhead design reveals itself. The bulkheads extended up to E-deck, which is about 11 feet above the waterline. But they were not hermetically sealed at the top. They didn't go all the way to the ceiling of the deck.
So, as Andrews calculated, with the first 5 or 6 compartments flooding simultaneously, the sheer physical weight of that water, tens of thousands of tons of it, pulled the heavy bow of the ship down deeper into the ocean.
And once the bow dipped low enough,
The water simply crested the top of the E-deck bulkhead and spilled over from compartment 5 into compartment 6 and then from 6 to 7. It's the ice cube tray analogy.
I love that analogy.
If you fill an ice cube tray too high at one end, the water doesn't stay in the first square. It just waterfalls over the little plastic dividers into the next slot and the next until the whole tray is submerged.
it was a cascading failure dictated entirely by gravity and geometry. The pumps were completely useless against the volume, and the bulkheads were defeated by the sinking angle. Andrews turned to Captain Smith and delivered the devastating truth. The ship was mathematically doomed. He estimated they had roughly an hour, maybe 2, before it foundered.
What's psychologically cruel about this sinking process is the pacing. The down angle of the ship altered noticeably during the first hour. But then, as the water filled the vast forward cargo spaces evenly, the rate at which the ship tilted actually slowed down significantly for the second hour.
It did.
The angle only worsened to about 5 degrees. To a human standing on the deck, it basically felt like it had stabilized.
That stabilization is a psychological killer, because for the passengers standing on the brightly lit, warm upper decks, the ship felt completely solid under their feet. It gave them a deeply false sense of hope.
It didn't feel like a sinking ship. It felt like a ship that had sustained some damage and had simply settled a bit lower in the water.
Which directly leads us into the absolute nightmare of the evacuation. Because that false sense of security made the initial loading of the lifeboats nearly impossible. Passengers literally laughed at the idea of getting into them.
Before we discuss the loading, we have to address the biggest point of public outrage regarding the Titanic. The lifeboat shortage. The Titanic carried 20 lifeboats, 16 standard wooden boats hanging on mechanical davits, and 4 Engelhart collapsible boats with wooden bottoms and heavy canvas sides.
Right.
Their total combined capacity was 1,178 people. But the ship was certified to carry over 3,500 people.
So they didn't even have enough seats for a third of the maximum capacity?
Exactly. And I want to clarify a massive misconception here. I always thought it was corporate greed.
Many people do.
But the source indicates it wasn't about cost. White Star Line wasn't too cheap to buy 20 more wooden boats. And it wasn't about physical space either. The ship was actually designed with advanced Welland davits, capable of holding up to 68 lifeboats.
The shortage was a direct result of severely outdated British Board of Trade regulations. The laws governing lifeboat numbers were calculated based on a ship's gross registered tonnage, not its passenger capacity.
Tonnage, not people.
Right. And those laws hadn't been updated since 1894, back when the largest ships afloat were a mere fraction of the Titanic's 46,000-ton size. The regulations capped out at ships of 10,000 tons.
Oh, wow.
The Titanic actually carried more lifeboats than the law legally required. But more importantly, we have to understand the maritime philosophy of the time. Lifeboats were not viewed as floating life rafts designed to simultaneously evacuate every single person on board.
Right, they were viewed as temporary ferries.
Exactly. The assumption was that ships navigating the busy North Atlantic sea lanes, equipped with the new Marconi wireless radios, would never be far from help. If a ship was damaged, it would supposedly stay afloat long enough for the lifeboats to simply ferry passengers back and forth from the distressed ship to the rescuing vessel.
Like a shuttle service.
Yes. And White Star Line also wanted uncluttered promenade decks so their wealthy first-class passengers could have uninterrupted views of the sea. It was an aesthetic choice, fully enabled by a lethally flawed, industry-wide safety philosophy.
So put yourself in Captain Smith's shoes. It's roughly midnight. He knows he has over 2,200 souls on board. He knows he has lifeboat capacity for exactly 1,178. And he knows mathematically that his ship is going to the bottom of the freezing ocean in less than 2 hours.
He knows.
He knows, as an absolute certainty, that over 1,000 people are going to die tonight, and it's his responsibility.
What's fascinating here is how Captain Smith handled this staggering psychological burden. Decades of mythology, heavily influenced by later films, have painted him as a man paralyzed by indecision, wandering around the bridge in a catatonic daze.
Like he just gave up.
Exactly. But the historical survivor accounts paint a very different picture. He immediately investigated the damage, ordered the wireless operators to send distress calls before he even had the final mathematical verdict from Andrews, and proactively ordered the crew to uncover the boats and muster the passengers.
Oh, so he was active.
Very.
Yeah.
He was seen all over the upper decks, personally directing the evacuation and trying to maintain order.
But the crew was completely unprepared to execute his orders. There was no systemic training. The source mentions there had only been one cursory lifeboat drill while docked in Southampton, where they just lowered 2 boats on the side, rowed around for a few minutes, and hauled them back up.
That was it.
No emergency drills had been conducted on the open ocean. Some crew members assigned to man the boats didn't even know how to properly row. And the sensory environment on the boat deck was pure chaos.
Oh, the noise.
Remember the engineers venting the high-pressure steam from the boilers? The sound of that steam escaping through the massive funnels was deafening. Survivor Lawrence Beasley compared it to the roar of 20 locomotives blowing off steam simultaneously.
The acoustic environment was so overpowering that the officers couldn't even yell orders at each other. They had to rely on exaggerated hand signals.
Waving their arm.
Yeah, and because there was no centralized public address system, no alarms, the stewards had to physically go door to door to wake passengers. The disparity in class became immediately apparent here.
How so?
First-class stewards were responsible for only a handful of cabins. They literally had the time to help passengers dress and tie their life belts. But second and third-class stewards had hundreds of people to manage. They mostly just ran down the corridors, throwing open doors, shouting at people to put on life belts, and moving to the next room.
And when they finally got to the lifeboats, the 2 officers, primarily in charge of launching them, Second Officer Lightoller on the port side, and First Officer Murdoch on the starboard side, interpreted Captain Smith's orders entirely differently.
This is a crucial point.
Smith told them, put the women and children in and lower away.
It's a classic failure of communication. Murdoch interpreted that order as women and children first. If he loaded all the available women and children in the immediate vicinity and there were still empty seats in the boat, he allowed men to board.
Okay.
But Lightoller on the port side interpreted the order as women and children only. He actively prevented men from boarding, standing at the davits with a gun, even if it meant launching the boats half empty.
And they did launch them half empty. It is so incredibly infuriating to read the launch statistics.
It really is.
Neither officer knew if the mechanical davits or the wooden keel of the boats could actually hold the weight of a fully loaded boat while suspended 70 feet in the air, so they heavily erred on the side of caution. Boat 7, the very first boat to leave the ship, had a capacity of 65 people. It left with 28.
Terrible.
Boat 1 had a capacity of 40. It left with exactly 12 people.
But part of that initial underloading was driven by the passengers themselves, who simply refused to board. Remember the false sense of security we discussed?
Right.
They were standing on a brightly lit, warm, seemingly stable luxury liner with a band playing inside. Looking over the edge of the boat deck, it was a 70-foot drop in the pitch black down to freezing, black water in a tiny, fragile, swaying wooden boat.
It's terrifying.
Millionaire John Jacob Astor famously looked at the boats and said, "We are safer here than in that little boat."
I want you to just pause and imagine that cognitive dissonance for a second. You are inside a floating palace. The crystal chandeliers are glowing, the fires are warm, and someone tells you to step out into the freezing void of the dark ocean in a wooden rowboat. It goes against every single biological survival instinct you possess.
It really does. But as the night wore on, past 1 a.m., the list to the bow became undeniable. The decks started slipping forward. The desperation grew, but the class divide proved fatal for hundreds. The third-class passengers were largely trapped below decks for much of the crucial first hour of the evacuation.
I'm glad we are getting to this because the popular narrative is that the rich locked the poor below decks to let them drown.
That's the Hollywood version.
Right. But the source clarifies that this wasn't maliciousness. It was structural, dictated by strict U.S. immigration laws. To prevent the spread of infectious diseases, steerage passengers legally had to be segregated so they could be medically processed at Ellis Island in New York, while first and second class were allowed to disembark directly at the Manhattan piers.
So the ship was built around that segregation.
So the Titanic was physically built with massive iron gates and partitions separating the classes.
Tragically, in the chaos of the sinking, some of those gates remained locked, and some crew members, strictly following their standard operating procedures, actively guarded them to prevent a rush on the lifeboats by the sheer numbers of third-class passengers.
So you were just following orders.
Irish survivor Margaret Murphy wrote hauntingly about sailors actually fastening down the hatchways to the third-class sections. Furthermore, the physical layout of the ship meant third-class passengers had to navigate a complex, unfamiliar maze of corridors and stairwells from the lowest decks just to reach the topside, by which time most of the lifeboats were already gone.
And the psychological reaction down in steerage is just haunting to read about. Psychologist Wynne Craig Wade analyzed the survivor testimonies and described a phenomenon of stoic passivity among some of the steerage passengers.
Stoic passengers.
You have to understand that the demographics generations of poor workers being told what to do by social superiors, combined with language barriers, led many of them to just wait patiently for official orders that never came. Survivor August Winterstrom described seeing hundreds of people in the third-class dining saloon circled around a preacher.
They were just praying.
They were just praying and crying, having seemingly given up all will to fight for their lives, accepting their fate.
Meanwhile, on the upper decks, as the math became obvious to everyone, we see profound, heartbreaking acts of individual courage and love. Ida Strauss, the wife of Macy's co-owner Isidore Strauss, was offered a seat in a lifeboat. She stepped back out, refusing to leave without her husband.
Where you go, I go.
She told him exactly that. They were last seen sitting together in a pair of deck chairs, quietly awaiting the end.
Wow.
And the industrialist Benjamin Guggenheim, realizing the situation was hopeless, famously took off his life vest, changed it into his top hat and evening dress, and declared his wish to go down like a gentleman.
And we absolutely cannot talk about courage without talking about the band. Wallace Hartley and his musicians.
Oh, the band.
The mythology says they played the hymn, "Nearer, My God, to Thee," as the ship slipped under the waves. The historical record in the source is a bit muddy on that specific song. Radio operator Harold Bride explicitly recalled them playing upbeat ragtime and a waltz called Autumn. But the indisputable, breathtaking fact is that they stood on the sloping, freezing boat deck, playing music to calm the panic, literally until the ocean washed up and took them. Not a single one of them survived.
Their sacrifice provided a surreal, poignant soundtrack to the unimaginable. Which brings us to the final hour. By 2:15 a.m., the mathematical reality Andrews had predicted overtook all denial. The water had flooded the forward decks and reached the boat deck. The ship's angle in the water began to increase rapidly, pivoting down.
The remaining lifeboats were rushed. It was pure desperation. Fifth Officer Lowe had to physically draw his revolver and fire warning shots along the side of the ship to keep a mob of men from jumping into his descending boat.
Total chaos.
The remaining collapsible boats were being frantically manhandled by passengers, and then the sheer physics of a dying ship took over. The sudden downward angle caused a giant wave of displaced water to wash along the boat deck, physically sweeping people away into the ocean. The forward funnel, a massive steel cylinder weighing tons, simply collapsed under its own weight and the immense pressure of the rising water, crushing swimmers as it smashed into the sea.
A mechanical stress on the ship's hull girder at this point became incomprehensible. Picture the ship as a giant lever. The bow is completely flooded, filled with tens of thousands of tons of dead-weight water, pulling relentlessly downward.
Okay.
But the massive stern section is still full of air, and it's being lifted high out of the water, its giant bronze propellers exposed to the night sky. The fulcrum of this lever is the weakest structural point in the midship superstructure, the open engine room hatch.
Wait, if the stern is lifting high into the air and the bow is pulling down, the ship is bending over the middle. So wouldn't the top decks, the superstructure, tear apart first under that extreme tension? For decades, everyone thought it sank completely intact, but we now know it snapped in half.
Right.
The source details two modern theories on how this horrific breakup actually happened. The popular top-down theory suggests exactly that. The break started at the upper decks under tension, tearing violently downwards through the hull until only the heavy keel at the bottom held the two halves together, acting like a giant hinge, dragging the stern up before it finally gave way.
That is the traditional model, but there is a very compelling alternative detailed in the source, the Mengo theory, formulated by researcher Roy Mengo.
How does that one work?
He argues for a bottom-to-top compression break. In this model, the immense weight didn't just pull the top apart, it actually caused the massive double-bottom keel of the ship to fail first under extreme compression forces. The heavy steel of the bottom buckled upwards into the lower decks, crushing the internal structure.
Yeah.
The ship was momentarily held together by the B-deck doubler plates, these incredibly heavy, thick steel segments meant to reinforce the areas around the smokestacks. But as the hull's internal heavy machinery spilled out at the fracture, those upper plates finally failed under the stress, and the ship violently tore completely apart.
And the way those massive pieces fell to the bottom is terrifying. The bow section was streamlined, aerodynamic. Once it detached, it filled completely with water and planed downward, hitting the seafloor 12,000 feet below at around 30 miles per hour.
30 miles an hour.
It hit with such immense kinetic force that the steel buckled, and it dug 66 feet deep into the solid ocean sediment. But the stern section.
The stern suffered a far more violent, chaotic descent. Because it was torn open at the front, but still contained sealed pockets of air in its aft compartments, it didn't plane smoothly. It tumbled and spun uncontrollably.
Spitting all the way down.
As it sank deeper, the immense hydrostatic water pressure caused the empty tanks and cofferdams to violently implode, tearing the steel ribbing apart from the inside. When the stern finally hit the bottom, it lacked any structural integrity, and the decks simply pancaked down on top of each other in a mangled heap.
But up on the surface, the horror was just beginning for those left behind. The lights flickered, flashed a dull red, and died, plunging the scene into absolute terrifying darkness. And when the stern finally disappeared beneath the surface at 2:20 a.m., roughly 1,500 people were left struggling in the water.
And we must be scientifically precise here about what killed them, because the common understanding is often slightly inaccurate. It is widely believed they died of hypothermia, a slow, gradual dropping of core body temperature that eventually leads to unconsciousness.
But the water they fell into was 28 degrees Fahrenheit.
Or -2 degrees Celsius. Salt water, due to its salinity, can stay liquid below the standard freezing point of fresh water.
So when a human body hits water that is literally below freezing, you don't just freeze slowly, your body violently rebels.
Precisely. You experience severe cold shock. The sudden brutal immersion triggers a massive involuntary gasp reflex in the mammalian nervous system. If your head happens to be underwater when that reflex hits, you instantly inhale freezing salt water and drown.
It's just instant.
Even if your head is above water, the shock causes uncontrollable hyperventilation and a staggering immediate spike in heart rate and blood pressure. For many of the older or less healthy passengers, this induced instant cardiac arrest.
They just had a heart attack.
Those who survived the initial shock lost all motor control in their limbs within minutes as the body desperately pulled blood to the core. Almost all of the victims in the water died within 15 to 30 minutes, long before clinical hypothermia would have normally set in.
And the people in the lifeboats, some of which were half empty, remember, floating just a few hundred yards away, had to sit in the pitch dark and listen to this. Survivor Jack Thayer, who was on an overturned boat, compared the sound of hundreds of people screaming and dying to the sound of locusts on a midsummer night.
That is haunting.
George Reams called it a dismal, supernatural moaning that he would never forget for the rest of his life.
The profound psychological trauma inflicted on the survivors in those boats in those moments is almost impossible to quantify. You transition from the mechanical, chaotic roar of a tearing ship and the shrieks of 1,000 dying people to eventually, as the cold shock took its toll, an absolute dead silence on the open ocean.
And it brings up the most agonizing ethical and survival dilemma imaginable. Do you row back to save them? You have empty seats. Boat 4 stayed close and pulled a few swimmers from the water. But in most boats, the passengers and crew debated in the dark and ultimately refused to return. Quartermaster Hitchens, who was in charge of Boat 6, notoriously refused the pleas of Margaret Brown to row back, callously referring to the dying victims in the water as just a lot of stiffs.
We have to analyze the horrific calculus they faced. If you row a small, fragile wooden boat back into a mass of hundreds of drowning, panicked, dying people in the pitch black, the sheer irrational instinct for survival means they will grab your oars, grab the gunnels, and swamp your boat.
They will drag you down.
They'll capsize you, and then every single person dies. Fifth Officer Harold Lowe in Boat 14 was the only officer who actively organized a return. He transferred his passengers to other boats, gathered a willing crew, and rowed back into the wreckage.
But the source notes he explicitly waited until the cries subsided before he rowed in, deliberately waiting for the mob to weaken to avoid being swamped.
A terrible choice to have to make.
And by the time he navigated through the horrific debris field of hundreds of floating bodies and lifebelts, he only found 4 men still alive. One of them died shortly after being pulled in.
And we must mention the raw survival story of Collapsible B. It had floated off the ship upside down as the boat deck flooded. About 30 men, including Second Officer Lightoller, Archibald Gracie, and the radio operator Harold Bride, managed to swim to it and climb onto the slippery, curved wooden hull.
Just balancing there.
They stood there in the freezing wash, shifting their weight in unison for hours to keep the trapped air pocket from escaping, beating back other desperate swimmers with oars to keep from sinking. It was the rawest, most brutal distillation of the will to survive.
Which takes us to the dawn. Imagine being on one of those boats. You survive the freezing night, severely traumatized, and at 4 a.m., the RMS Carpathia finally arrives.
Captain Arthur Rostron of the Carpathia had pushed his ship to its absolute mechanical limits, dodging icebergs in the dark, redirecting all steam from the ship's heating to the engines to reach the distress coordinates. As dawn finally broke, the survivors in the lifeboats finally saw the environment that had killed them. The ocean was studded with massive icebergs and a vast, unbroken plain of pack ice stretching to the horizon.
And this is where the infuriating reality of the SS Californian comes roaring back.
Oh, the Californian.
The Carpathia steamed 58 miles through dangerous ice to rescue them. But the Californian had been stopped in the ice just 10 to 12 miles away the entire time. Their radio operator, Cyril Evans, the guy Phillips told to shut up, had gone to bed at 11:30 p.m., exactly 10 minutes before the Titanic struck the iceberg.
But it gets worse. The Californian's crew on watch actually saw the Titanic's distress rockets exploding in the night sky. Second Officer Herbert Stone reported seeing these white rockets to Captain Stanley Lord, who was resting in the chart room.
And what did he do?
Captain Lord asked lazily if they were company signals, and ultimately did absolutely nothing to investigate. If the radio operator had stayed at his post, or if Captain Lord had acted on the visual evidence of the rockets, the Californian could have reached the Titanic well before it sank. Hundreds of lives could have easily been saved.
It's just devastating. And I'm looking at the demographics of who survived and who didn't in the source, and it absolutely reflects the brutal reality of the evacuation we talked about. Out of the 2,201 people on board, only 710 survived. Roughly 1,500 died.
Staggering numbers.
When you break it down by class, the disparity is stark. 100% of the second-class children were saved. Not a single one died. But for third class, 52 of the 79 third-class children died. Almost all of the first-class women survived, but 92% of the second-class men died.
This raises an important question. Who is ultimately accountable for a systemic failure of this magnitude? The world was in a state of absolute shock, grief, and outrage. Both the U.S. Senate and the British Rec Commissioner launched massive public inquiries. They called hundreds of witnesses, trying to assign blame.
I was reading about those inquiries. What kind of questions were they asking? I mean, did White Star Line go down in flames? Did Ismay, who survived in a collapsible boat, get crucified by the press?
Ismay was utterly vilified by the press, branded a coward for surviving while women and children drowned. The inquiries grilled him relentlessly on whether he had pressured Captain Smith to maintain speed. They grilled Captain Lord of the Californian for his inaction, but legally.
Yeah.
Both inquiries ultimately found no gross negligence by the White Star Line. They concluded that Captain Smith had merely followed long-standing maritime practices that had not previously been proven unsafe. The U.S. inquiry essentially categorized the disaster as an act of God.
An act of God. It took the freezing deaths of 1,500 people to prove that the standard operating procedures of the entire maritime industry were lethally flawed.
Exactly. It forced a total global reckoning. The disaster directly led to the creation of the International Ice Patrol, funded by maritime nations, which still monitors and reports on icebergs today. And it led to the establishment of SOLAS, the International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea.
They finally changed the rules.
The regulations that doomed them were finally rewritten. Ships were legally mandated to carry lifeboats for every single soul on board. Mandatory lifeboat drills were instituted for passengers, and ship radios had to be manned 24 hours a day without exception.
The cultural impact of this event has never faded. It is the ultimate cautionary tale of human arrogance against nature. And I always think about Robert Ballard finally finding the wreck in 1985. The bodies of the victims were long gone, the calcium of their bones consumed by the deep ocean environment. But the tanned leather of their shoes survived.
The shoes on the seafloor.
And Ballard found pairs of shoes lying perfectly side by side on the seafloor, exactly where a person had drifted down and laid to rest. It is a haunting, silent monument.
It really is.
So what does this all mean? We started out by saying this wasn't just a sudden lightning strike. The Titanic wasn't sunk by just an iceberg. It was sunk by a systemic cocktail of hubris, normalized deviance, outdated Board of Trade regulations, brittle iron rivets, a broken radio leading to a backlog of trivial telegrams, a sleeping radio operator 10 miles away, and an unforgiving ocean.
And as a final thought to leave you with, consider the brutal paradox of the weather that night. We discussed at length how the exceptionally calm, glass-like sea was the precise environmental trap that hid the iceberg from the lookouts until it was exactly too late.
Right.
But that same dead calm water was the only reason the crew was able to safely lower the heavy, clumsy wooden lifeboats 70 feet down the side of the ship without them swinging wildly and smashing against the steel hull. If there had been a rough sea, waves would have crashed against the berg, making it visible, and perhaps Murdoch could have steered clear. But if they had still struck the berg in a rough sea, launching those lifeboats would have been near impossible. The lifeboats would have been destroyed against the ship's side in the swells, and the death toll could have been total. The exact same environment that doomed the ship was the exact same environment that allowed the 710 to survive.
A perfectly balanced, lethal paradox. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the sources. We invite you to keep exploring the complexities of history. We'll see you next time.